I'm Elizabeth Hinton. I'm a professor of history, African American studies, and law at Yale University. And as a historian, I'm kind of obsessed with this tendency that we see in U.S. history, which is that every time we get the expansion of citizenship and rights to new groups of people, in both cases, African Americans, there is an immediate kind of mobilization of new criminal laws and a small incarceration, at least initially, right? We see this happening, of course, after slavery is abolished. With the abolition of slavery, we get new laws throughout the southern states called the Black Codes that basically make it a crime to not be employed by a white person, as well as a number of other things. And we also get the simultaneous rise of a new system of penal labor called the convict lease system. So this was the first kind of mini mass incarceration. And then you flash forward 100 years to 1965, a year after Jim Crow is dismantled with the Civil Rights Act, and shortly, or actually at the same time that Lyndon Johnson is sending the Voting Rights Act to Congress, he calls, Lyndon Johnson that is, calls for a massive all-out war on crime. So at the same time that we're getting what's known as the second Reconstruction, right, the fall of Jim Crow and new citizenship rights for Black Americans that had been previously disfranchised, the federal government, for the first time in the nation's history, is going to begin an investment in local police, in court operations, and the prison system. Johnson decided to break with the previous few hundred years of U.S. history to begin a new role for the federal government in this arena, at the same time as we have a massive civil rights revolution and at the height of progressive social change in the U.S. And these policies that kind of originate in the Johnson administration end up laying the groundwork for the expansion and militarization of police that we see, but also mass incarceration. Now, a lot of people say, oh, state and local law enforcement, that's a local matter. The federal government doesn't have anything to do with that. But during this period, in the 1960s and 1970s, the federal government was influential in requiring states to make policing and revamping the prison system a priority. And they did so through new incentive programs and new grant funding available to state and local governments to pursue these new federal objectives. Every state and local government were required to develop criminal justice planning agencies that essentially modernized American law enforcement and crime control. So the federal government, by the time Ronald Reagan took office, Ronald Reagan's administration is often seen as kind of the origins of mass incarceration or the war on drugs, but the federal government had already invested nearly $30 billion in today's dollars into modernizing and transforming the criminal justice system at all levels. So behind these policies that are laying the groundwork for the massive explosion in prison populations we will see in the 1980s and 1990s are sets of assumptions about Black Americans' poverty and crime that lead policymakers to target many of these new policing programs in low-income communities of color. So something kind of strange begins to happen during this period with crime control strategies, and that's that police are no longer being charged with responding to crime that actually happens. But police are now being charged to respond to crime preemptively or proactively. That is, responding to crime where it is thought to occur. And this strategy for law enforcement sets a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy in motion, because if you assume that there's more crime in Black and brown communities and low-income communities of color, and you deploy more police there and you militarize more police there, that's going to lead to more contact between residents and police, more arrests, and therefore higher rates of crime in those same communities, because the crime rate depends not on convictions but on arrests. And if you have more police in a community, you're going to have more arrests in a community. This is where, too, the kind of foundational logics of American policing really begin to cohere, and that is the kind of purpose and function of police in middle class and white communities is to protect property and protect people from outsiders, and the purpose of function in low-income communities of color tends to be to find suspects or potential suspects, identify them, and remove them through the community through incarceration. So these flawed logics and investments have really structured many of our domestic social policies in the decade after the civil rights movement, and in doing so have undone many of the gains of the civil rights movement. Instead of continuing the war on poverty's investments in schools and in jobs and in better housing for people, the investments into policing and surveillance and incarceration end up surpassing those goals. And I think my work really shows that, now with more of than a half century of these policies, that they really, really have been arguably at least among the biggest domestic policy failures in this country. Because in the same communities where we see the most police and the highest rates of incarceration, we also see the highest rates of gun violence. These programs have not actually led to more public safety. We need to stop managing the material consequences of poverty and inequality as they appear through crime and violence, and begin to think of what a more robust set of investments in these same low-income communities would be that would address the root causes of these issues.